Okay, so we are turning our attention to another issue which concerns electricity. Right now, we're currently grappling with an energy crisis. There have been outages in many parts of the country owing to is it failure of transmission or failure of generation? But I do know that a few of the discos have been sending messages to their customers as to what could be responsible for the outages that they have been experiencing. And we all know that there is a few shortage in the country. Normally, when there is an outage of electricity, many people turn to their generators. And for many homes, they're powered by petrol, which is currently very scarce to come by, or it's still a problem in the country, even though I think that problem should be easing sometime soon. But what other alternatives are there? The federal government did come up with an idea for rural areas under the Rural Electrification Scheme, and there is an entire agency for that, and there is a fund underneath that agency to look after that particular issue. We're speaking this morning with Dr. Sanusi Mohammed Ohiari, who is the Executive Director, Rural Electrification Fund under the Rural Electrification Agency. You're welcome to Sunrise Daily this morning.
Glad to be here.
Well, the mandate of the Rural Electrification Agency seems to be the mission, or the mandate. Let me start with the mandate now. Is to promote rural electrification in the country, coordinate rural electrification programs in the country, and administer the Rural Electrification Fund, which you head. So can you give us a scope? Can you tell us just how bad the problem was before the Rural Electrification Agency came on board, and how far they've gone, you know, with trying to get rural communities to have electricity?
Thank you very much, Maupe. As you know, the Rural Electrification Agency was created in 2005 out of the Electric Power Sector Reform Act, as the Rural Electrification Fund as well was created at the same time. And at that time, the government was moving away from funding rural electrification, the power sector, 100%. It was a vertically integrated system. The model was for government to spend on everything: generation, transmission, distribution, and rural electrification. For lack of, inadequate, funding, the government thought it wise to, sell off, some components of the sector and then retain rural electrification because, of course, it was not very viable to private players, and they were not interested at the time. So, but government still needed to look for a way to fund and take care of those people in rural communities. So, when the agency came on board, the mandate was to look at, underserved and unserved areas, and the figure we have from, say, around 6-7 years ago was that about 83 million Nigerians did not have access to electricity. But this figure, I must qualify, it's based on secondary data that was available, but it gave us a sense of where to look in terms of those that didn't have access to electricity. And out of this figure, we're looking at connecting 51 million Nigerians through the grid. So if you take like a 10-20 kilometer buffer around where the grid lines stop, would imagine that the grid would extend to those areas and cover those areas. So outside these areas, we still had about 32 million Nigerians, which for us is our core area that we needed to focus on. And we needed to come up with quickly with programs and plans on how to electrify these rural communities. That's why you've been hearing a lot about solar, mini grids, solar home systems, and even recently we went into a program that seeks to bring more innovative ways outside solar, renewable energy, technologies, to help power rural communities.
You're focused largely on renewables.
Yes.
And for some people, they think that since I don't want to say your mandate is now renewables, because it was seen that as a result of focusing on areas that are hard to reach or that will not be able to get connected to the grid, those were the solutions that could easily come up.
Yes.
You could easily come up with. But looking at the problems that we currently have, even with those connected to the grids, there have been questions as to whether those solutions are not applicable to even certain areas that are normally on the grid, but perhaps would also need special considerations,
yes,
for renewables, so to speak.
Yes.
Have you had to go outside the mandate of core rural areas to also reach those kinds of places?
You're right, Maupe. In fact, we are considering, changing the name of the agency to add renewable. So maybe Rural Renewable Energy Agency, just to, take care of.
That's how quickly.
Yes, it has gotten to that level, and we are currently with the National Assembly. They are reviewing the act, and it's one of the proposals before them. Hopefully, they consider it. Now, talking about areas within grid-connected areas, that still, we call them underserved. So they are within the grid-connected areas, but they still don't get enough power and energy. So yes, we do intervene in those areas as well. As a matter of fact, if I leave your studio now, we are going to, for a signing ceremony for a program, one of our programs funded by the EU and German government, where we are focusing on interconnected mini-grids. So interconnected means there is already some power coming from the grid, but not stable. It's epileptic. So we are now applying the solutions that we usually apply to completely isolated areas to those communities. So it involves partnerships with the DISCO, other agencies that certify the grid, like NEMSA, and also the Ministry of Power and the likes. So yes, we do intervene. As a matter of fact, our capital project, which was the only source of providing electricity before we came, still focuses on providing transformers, extending the grid to areas that need special intervention, which we still do till date. But what's interesting is that since 2017, when we came on board, we've been able to attract more funding for off-grid technologies and projects and programs away from the capital projects. So we still have capital projects, but we have lots of programs now and funding coming in, for off-grid.
Okay, so can you give us what the impact has been for the rural communities? I imagine that this is not just electricity for electricity's sake.
Exactly.
For the communities that you have been able, so far so good, can you give us a rough idea of how many communities you have been able to impact and how many people as a result of that first?
Okay, so let me answer the question in two folds. So for purely household connections from new programs away from capital projects like I mentioned, we've been able to do over 400,000 households. And when you multiply this by number of people per household in Nigeria, you're looking at, say, 5 people per household. Maybe 2.5 million people have been impacted for just households. For businesses, small and medium enterprises, we've done over 3,000 small and medium enterprises that have been impacted by some of these programs. And in terms of job numbers as well, we've done over 5,000. In terms of job numbers from all of our programs. But then this does not include programs that, for instance, energizing education, because we didn't know how to, calculate number of, students as households. So we have 37 universities that we're looking at. We're providing electricity. We've done, in the first phase 9, we've done 7 out of the 9. And this is impacting hundreds of thousands of students and lecturers and medical students and all of those within the university, which also has training facilities for renewables for those students in those universities. So that's another layer, of impact. And for in terms of the number of people, like I mentioned earlier, over 2.5 million people have been impacted so far. 2.5
million people
yes.
have been impacted so far. And, I wasn't quite sure, but I knew that universities had come under the areas, I don't know whether you categorize them as underserved, but I know they had come under some special consideration
exactly.
for renewables
yes.
as well. And
yes.
I know that the Rural Electrification Agency was involved in that.
Yes.
So you say how many universities in all?
So we're doing 37 universities, but we're taking them in phases. The first phase, we've done 7. And the second phase we'll do 7. We'll do 7. First phase 7 out of 9. Second phase we are doing 7, and then like that. So this university, like you said, is a special intervention program from the president, handed down through the ministry to Rural Electrification Agency to intervene in. So even if they are not largely in rural communities, because of the special importance and attachment the president has for students and young people, he felt that this was one of the ways to reach out and impact, their lives. And we're not just doing, universities as well. With COVID, we had to also intervene in health sector. We did some primary health centers. Some are still ongoing. I think we've completed 200. And then the World Bank is also funding about 50 isolation centers and general hospitals. And we're also going to do another 400 primary health centers, going into this year or next year. So, because power is very important and is important across every sector. So we tend to have a lot of special interventions that we need to intervene in. But what's important and what we need to keep in mind is we have also designed programs that are focusing mainly on those in rural communities, which has, helped them to, generate incomes, help their socioeconomics in the rural communities. And we are not just focusing on electrons going into the households. We ensure that for every household in that community, we are looking at productive uses, we are looking at MSMEs, how does it transform their lives so that they can stay there comfortably and they are happy. And I may have to mention this. For those programs, especially for the mini-grids, these people have 24 hours electricity and they enjoy this all year round. So they even have power more than some of us in the cities that are currently grappling with, like you had said in your introduction, lack of a stable power.
Well, let's take a break at this point. We'll be back to continue this conversation. Please stay with us. We're still with Dr. Sanusi Mohammed Ohiari, who is Executive Director, Rural Electrification Fund under the Rural Electrification Agency. We'll now flip the conversation to Lagos, where my colleagues have questions coming from.
Well, thanks a lot, Mark. Dr. Ohiari, electricity is a very, very important topic in Nigeria. If it's not fuel scarcity, it is inadequate power supply. And I don't know if you can hear me. Okay.
Yes,
so,
I can hear you.
All right. So it's either fuel scarcity, which we're experiencing now, or inadequate electricity supply. And those are really touchy, topics. And it's all the more touchy because a lot of things are very vague in that sector. The more you see, the less you know, as it were. But break this down for us, because you are in a very interesting sector, the rural areas. So the urban people who complain a lot might not need to direct their questions at you, but the rural people are important as well. And looking at that document, the Rural Electrification Strategy Implementation Document, which was put out a couple of years back, you try to break down the statistics. And I'd like to know how far you have gone in meeting some of the targets that was set. So imagine that more than 70 million Nigerians lack access, to quality or reliable electricity supply, and majority, in fact, more than half of the population are rural dwellers. And that target was to meet the target in some sense. I think about, what was it, 75% of that by 2020. That was the target in that document. How far have you been able to meet the target, seeing that we're in 2022 already? Have you been able to do that 75%?
Thank you very much, Coyote. Very interesting question. So in terms of the target from RECIP, the targets were based on, certain amounts of money being provided. So the target was for the agency to provide 1.1 million connections every year through to 2030. 2030 is the year we are hoping to at least do 90%. But, in the absence of having the kind of funding that we need, we have not been able to meet this target, and that's the honest truth. But we've been able to look for other sources of funding, like I had mentioned, from World Bank, from African Development Bank. And with what we have, we are doing our bit. And that's where all of these programs that you hear about and all of these connections that we've made that has impacted about 2.5 million people is coming from. So these monies were supposed to be provided through the Rural Electrification Fund, and the sources of funding for the Rural Electrification Fund has not been very consistent, and it has not been strengthened. So this is something that we're also discussing with the National Assembly and the government in view of the review currently going on, so that we can have sustainable funding, because the World Banks and the African Development Banks and the EUs and the likes will not continue to give provide money all the time. So this is where we are.
So in essence, if it's 2.5 million, you're still struggling to hit 5% of that target, 70 million by 2020 or thereabout. So clearly we have a...
So don't take the 70 million as what the Rural Electrification Agency alone is supposed to provide, electricity, or the number that we are supposed to meet. Out of that 70, or I think it was even 80 million, 51 million were supposed to be connected by the grid. So if you look at the off-grid, the balance, which is about maybe 32 million, about 26 million were supposed to be provided through mini-grids. So the target was to do at least 1,000 mini-grids before 2030. And the rest, which is about 700 and something, were supposed to be provided through solar home systems. So this is the breakdown. So if you say, it may be a bit misleading if you say the entire 70 or 80 million we are supposed to provide electricity to them, because the idea is that the grid will continue to grow and we take care of the most vulnerable, unserved people, which is around 32 million, like I mentioned.
Right. So the point here is to try to get the right figure, and I'm glad you have broken it down further. So if the target is 30 million or thereabouts, and you've done 2.5, that's less than 10% of 30 million or 32 million. So, you know, it just helps us understand what we need to cover. But you talked about funding, and if there's anything that has been a challenge, it will be funding over time. What kind of fund, just how much funds did you need for that period of time, and what was the challenge? How couldn't you get those funds? Because those projections were made based on, you know, the realities or your personal, you know, projections. I thought, okay, it will be easy to get this fund. So how much did you need, and why was it difficult to get the funds?
So from our analysis, would need about $2.5 billion. And we've only just raised, from every source that we have, about $590 million.
So why was it difficult to raise the funds? Because, again, you made the projections based on, I mean, the current reality. You thought it would be easy to raise this fund. So you said, you know what, by 2020, we should do 75%, 25, 90%. So why was it difficult to meet your target?
Okay, so it was a bit difficult because although the Rural Electrification Fund was created in 2005, but it didn't start operations until 2017 when we came on board. It was only when we came on board we operationalized it, and at the time it was only the seed fund that was available, which was less than, which was about $4 million that was there. And from that $4 million, the agency has been able to attract up to 590 from other sources outside government, right? So the capital project yearly budget is still there, but that's doing more of transformers and streetlights and the likes. So it was difficult because it took us 12 years later, you know, to start. And like other funds, you know, like TED Fund, the Ecological Fund and the likes, the states categorically where these funds should come from and what percentage should go where, right? Ours needs to rely on, for instance, the regulator, Nigeria Electricity Regulatory Commission, who is yet to determine that particular rate that should be coming to the fund. However, they've been supportive in other sources that concerns them, like, you know, remitting the yearly surplus, you know, to the fund, and also all of the fines, from eligible customers and licenses that comes to the fund, which is negligible in terms of the amount if you compare it to the scale of the problem. Now, another challenge that we've had is that with Finance Act coming on board, there's been a back and forth in terms of whether these monies that NERC should remit to us should first go to consolidated revenue, or whether this money should come directly to the fund. The National Assembly had intervened and said, oh, the act is clear because of the importance of rural education, this fund should come directly. But then we keep getting letters, from Auditor General, Ministry, Finance, all of these people sending another signal to NERC not to send this money. So all of this back and forth, I don't think augurs well for the plans that we have. And until maybe the act is reviewed, which is currently under review, and the sources of funding for REF is strengthened, we'll continue having this back and forth. And to be honest, it's a bit disappointing because, rural education power is very important, especially to rural people. In fact, it should be something that should be like an emergency that the government needs to, consider. But unless we all come together and agree that this is an emergency, and we need to tackle it as an emergency. If we keep having all of these back and forths amongst government agencies, then we'll continue to have this problem. But we are also very happy with, some of the support we've gotten from the president so far. you know, all of the programs, you know, the Solar Nigeria 140 billion for loans and all of that is as a result of some of the complaints we made and, you know, looking for solutions, you know, to them. So, but we are hoping, because the most sustainable one, all of these are stopgap, ad hoc, if you like, measures, you know, to funding. But the most sustainable would be strengthening the fund and just knowing how to plan based on what you're expecting. You know, like the TED funds and the likes, they know what is coming in. They work with the, you know, FIRS, and once the money comes in or before it comes in, they can plan, you know, for what they want to do. So unless we have reach that level where we are able to plan properly based on what is coming in, then we'll still struggle. But in the meantime, we are not sitting down. We are still reaching out to financiers, having discussions every day to get more funding, you know, to carry on with our programs.
Well, my question was actually along the line of the sustainability that you just referenced now. I mean, part of what the Rural Electrification Fund is about is to provide this supply in a way that would allow for reasonable return on investment through what is called appropriate tariff that is economically responsive and supportive of the average rural consumer. So I'm wondering right now, how is that to be operationalized? Because just as you said, it is one thing to raise these funds, unsustainable, just as you were saying. Part of the reasons for the Rural Electrification Fund is to provide part that can be, that's affordable for the people that you are providing it for. So if it's, maybe that raises the question of whether or not it's a social program or a commercially viable program.
So the idea is to use the funds that we have to support and incentivize private players to come in. And the idea is also not to use the funds for subsidies, consumption subsidies, but rather use it to support infrastructural development as a way of capital grants and subsidies. So, you know, if we have a total cost of, say, 10 naira, you know, to put up a mini grid somewhere, the fund looks at it, does its evaluation, and look at the need to bring in these capital grants and how it affects the tariff in the rural community. And then we provide this to the developer, who then goes to put the project on the ground, and it will be in charge of operating and maintaining it over its life cycle of, say, 20 years. So for that 20 years, the agreement would be that there will be 24 hours electricity in that community. If there's any problem, the developer will take care of it. And of course, you know, this goes into the tariff, you know, that they will charge as well. So this is the model that we currently run.
Right now of this template, this model that you talked about?
Say that again?
Is there any operator now operating this model that you just described?
Yes, yes, we have so many of them. In fact, in the very first call that we did in 2018 with the seed money that we met, we were able to get about 12 mini-grid developers that provided electricity to over 5,000 households. And then we also did about 19+ thousand solar home systems to various communities. In the second call, we are doing 51 mini-grids that will provide electricity to over 19,000 households as well. And then the NEP, which is also another program, you know, under the REA, is also providing electricity to various communities. In fact, as we speak, they have over 40 mini-grids that have been completed and awaiting commissioning. So yes, for the very first time since we came on board, players, developers have benefited. I mean, some of our commissioning is, you know, they are all over the media. These people are enjoying electricity. We go on regular checks, monitoring and evaluation to see that, you know, the systems are still in place and working. And we're happy, you know, to report that, you know, they've been working so far. The developers are happy, the rural people are happy. REA is happy with, you know, the services and, you know, this model that is being provided so far.
And what's the return on investment so far from these players that have made the investments?
I wouldn't know. Maybe you'd have to bring in one of them. You know,
no, I asked that because I mean you talked about sustainability of the project, and if it's going to be private sector driven, it most certainly has to be commercially viable for them.
It is viable, and I mean, of course, you know, they are bringing in their own money as well. So what we are giving is just part grants. So they are also looking, talking to commercial banks, even trying to get international investors to invest in this project. So for them to bring in their money, of course, you know, they would have done, you know, the maths, and it's viable for them. We've not had any complaints that it's not viable. We've had complaints about trying to scale up, trying to raise more funding so that they can participate in more of the programs. We've had complaints about Forex and how it affects, you know, their businesses. We've had complaints about, you know, customs and how it affects bringing in some of their products. But we haven't really had complaint about them, you know, being viable or not. Because before they even go into investing, you know, they bring proposals based on viability, and we see what the gap is and how we can, you know, fill it in. You know, so yeah, that's where we are.
So many questions running through my head now, but I just wanted to find out, is there a gradation, you know, a grading of the rural areas in the rural areas? I ask that because, you know, there are, I mean, you talked about micro, small, and medium enterprises in these rural areas. Some of these, you know, businesses are, they're in farmlands. They're in the deep farmlands and all. So I'm wondering if there is such grading in these rural areas, because there are rural areas and there are rural areas. I don't know if you understand what I'm saying.
I understand what you're saying, Ayo. And yes, there are gradings in terms of population and how dispersed they are. So for instance, if you look at a cluster of, say, 400, 500 households that is largely rural, you know, spanning a few kilometers and far away from the grid, such clusters will be very viable for mini grids. But then you can also have dispersed population like farmlands where you'd see one household here and then the next one is like a kilometer away and, you know, very dispersed. You know, for those sort of rural communities, solar home systems would fit in. And then you have some that are like businesses, like a big farm in a rural community that needs power. So that one would fit in under, for instance, our Energizing Agriculture program, which is something we also just started. And yeah, you're right. All of these gradings are taken into consideration during the surveys, and it goes into the proposals, you know, that eventually comes to us, you know, and also the viability are also taken into consideration.
Right. So quickly, what's the tariff for the rural areas compared to what we have in the urban areas? Because I think it will paint the picture better. So what's the tariff?
So you cannot compare or use the same scale of tariff. Here in the urban areas, we do kilowatt hours or we do units, you know, per unit, you know, the tariffs are set like that. But for rural communities, you need to understand their psyche, you need to understand their language and how they think. They just want to know how much this will cost them in a month. So innovative ways, business models that, you know, have come on board shows that averagely 3,000 naira would be okay, averagely, for a rural community every month, you know, to get 24 hours electricity. Mind you, these people do not consume as much electricity as we do in the cities. They have, they consume less than 1 kilowatt hour. What me and you know as 1 kilowatt hour or 1 unit in a day. Most of them are 0.5, 0.4. So it's just for lighting and charging, and, you know, most of them go to the farms during the day. At night, they just on it for a few hours. So if you look at their consumption vis-a-vis what we do in the cities, then you know that, you know, they don't consume much. So this goes into setting, you know, the tariff. Also understanding their business cycles. You don't want to be charging them every month or every year. Sometimes when they go to the farms and they make money, you know, in the farming season, they can pay upfront for a few months. And when they don't have money, you know that when you know, the farming season comes, they'll be able to offset some of this. So the local players, the local developers understand the psyche of the rural people, and they've applied this in their business model. So averagely what we see for households is around 3,000. For businesses, it could be slightly higher, you know, because they're making money and they can afford it.
Okay,
But,
so
it's not in doubt. The willingness and ability to pay for these services by these rural communities had been carried out long ago. And, you know, they are happy, they are not complaining, you know, they are paying. And what the developers are looking at now is to stimulate more demand so that they can consume more energy, right, in those rural communities, and they can pay more.
Stimulate more demand how?
So, for instance, some of them have now gone into investing in productive activities or productive use instead of just supplying electricity. So if they know that maybe a rural person, you're living in a rural community, you have like a grinding machine, that is not very efficient, and because of that, you're unable to use as much power. They can invest in, buying a very efficient grinding machine, or if you are in a riverine area where you are in the business of fishery, they can get like a cold storage sort of appliance, for you. So you pay over time while you're doing your business. It's also part of the innovation that they've had to, because they need to sell more power to make more money. So if they bring in as part of the business model where they are providing appliances, efficient appliances that can also be run on their systems in rural communities, then they're able to
I was just going to say that, I mean, ask you about that, because when you're talking about how they're in rural communities and they're not using much electricity, there's been a quest to try and get rural dwellers to get into agribusinesses.
Yes.
So, for instance, even this rice,
yes.
Which was just displayed here in Abuja a few weeks ago,
yes.
There have been questions as to whether they should be milled in the places closest to where they are farmed.
Yeah.
When these kinds of demands come, electricity will be needed.
Yeah.
Do you think that the renewables, as we currently have them, would they be able to meet up with the demand that this equipment might need?
Of course. I mean, we are doing projects in universities, as large as universities are, based on renewables. Milling machine would not be a problem at all. And as a matter of fact, we have 2 programs, one on energizing agriculture, which is looking to take care of specifically what you've just raised, and the other is strictly on productive use, funded by African Development Bank, which is looking at buying these equipments for rural communities, for small and medium enterprises in rural areas, that are currently, especially for those mini grids that are currently running. So we are looking at all the angles, really.
How effective an alternative do you think that renewables will be as we move on? Because we know that we're not where we ought to be right now with our electricity production and consumption. How viable do you think that renewables could be from what you have learned from the rural areas? I mean,
renewables, the technology have been proven, the business models, the viability have been proven. It's not in doubt. But, for cities, there's argument for using it as complement, right, to the grid. But for extremely rural communities that don't have options, then it's the best, option and technology available, from our experience.
Well, we'll keep tabs on what is happening within your agency, but we have to thank you so much for coming on Sunrise Daily this morning. Dr. Sanusi Mohammed Ohiare is Executive Director of the Rural Electrification Fund under the Rural Electrification Agency. Thank you once again for coming to our studios this morning.
Thank you.